So the demise of the buffalo is one of the great natural resource management events of the modern world, and it's complicated. There's many sides to it. I take my sense of what happened from the point of view of economic history or political economy, as opposed to a kind of racialized view of what happened. Clearly, it's for the indigenous people, this was a fantastic source of food that was acquired. It had been sustainable, and then along comes the fur trade. So the fur trade is kind of the economic foundation for Canada. Beaver were trapped in every part of the country, but in other places the fur trade was sustained much longer, especially in the north. And beaver was part of a long commodity chain, involved trapping in northern Canada or in the parklands, having the fur shipped out to one of the factories like Moose Factory or York Factory on the coast of Hudson's Bay and James Bay, transported to London, auctioned off, and they were converted to felt, and the felt was converted to a hat. So one might say is Canada is a country that came into being because of hats.
So the Hudson's Bay Company history goes back to 1670 when King Charles II granted the company roughly 40% of what we now call Canada, an area encompassing all the waterways and drainage of the Hudson's Bay drainage, to what they called the Governor and Company of Adventurers trading into Hudson's Bay. We now call it Hudson's Bay Company. And that land grant that was granted by the King really gave Hudson's Bay Company the monopoly on trade in the fur trade in Canada through the northern route of the Hudson's Bay. And what that meant for the company was that they were able to circumvent the French in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and enter through Hudson Bay and set up depots and large posts along the bay to encourage trade with local Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And the early days of trade did seem to be quite amicable and successful because, of course, if they did not trade in a good way, people wouldn't have traded with them. So their relationships with the Cree and Dene and even Inuit up in the north really had to be really good. They had to respect local customs and traditions in order to make that relationship work. And Hudson's Bay Company was successful for quite a few years before they started to receive competition from other companies, and they started to have to change their whole approach. So while they predominantly had these posts along the bay and relied on Indigenous traders to come north to trade with them, eventually they had to shift gears, especially as they started to see competition moving into the interior from the Northwest Company and other traders. Hudson's Bay Company had to really rethink their strategy. And part of what makes the company successful was that adaptability, that ability to change their business strategy to really think about how they can continue on and be successful. So the company began to explore interior trade, and that posed some challenges for them, for sure. They definitely weren't as prepared, perhaps, as some of the other trading companies like Northwest Company, who had already really well established this idea of traveling to trade with Indigenous peoples, whereas HBC had predominantly relied on people traveling to them. And so they set up these interior trading posts to circumvent the competition. They definitely saw a huge decline when Northwest Company really pushed inland, and so they needed to do something. And in their trade, predominantly in the north, it was of course for beaver and other fur-bearing animals, but as they moved further to the interior, they needed to rely on different species. And by moving inland and into the grasslands region, in the plains, what we call in Canada, they really needed to change gears again. And so we start to see a more reliance on bison and trading posts that we find in and along the Souris River mouth, in that we're focused predominantly on supplying food for the fur trade and not furs. So it's completely different than what you see in their boreal forest posts, where they're really relying on the fur bearers. Here they're relying on provisioning food for their fur traders to continue branching inland, to continue trading with the indigenous groups, and to continue fighting back on that competition with the other companies that are emerging into the area. So the company really was adaptable, and while some of their relationships were definitely problematic, I think in the earlier period they definitely worked really well towards amicable trade. But what we start to see during this period of competition is these companies really working to who can get the clients, essentially. Who can they get to bring in the trade and to trade with them? So the company starts really kind of being more aggressive in their approach, as well as the Northwest Company too. So we start to see the rivalry between these two kind of corporate companies really starting to affect how things are playing out here on the ground. And that's where we start to see changes in the fur trade during this intense period of competition, where we still see Indigenous people have a lot of options, because if they don't like the way you're trading or they don't like the goods you're bringing in, they can choose your competitor. But it is definitely differing the relationship. And so Hudson's Bay Company starts really pushing towards encouraging people to trade with them. And of course, Northwest Company is doing the same. So it's a heated period of time, and people on the ground are definitely feeling the pressure from the higher ups. And with Hudson's Bay Company head office being in London, of course, they're feeling different kind of pressure. People that have never been to Canada are trying to dictate the rules for a place that they know nothing about. And so that definitely affected how the company operated, and affects how, when you look back at how HBC responded to things versus how Northwest Company responded, you can definitely see differences because of the way that the corporate structure of Hudson's Bay Company. And so the company starts pressing again for more pemmican. They need more pemmican to supply the fur trade. Of course, pemmican is like highly dense caloric food, which really helped fuel the brigades and moving on these inland posts.
I think most Canadians don't realize how important pemmican was in our history in Alberta or in the history of Canada. But at a certain point, as a food energy source, pemmican became absolutely necessary for the fur trade and the fur trade's expansion as it gained pace and numbers in the 18th century, and as it trailed further and further west from Montreal or Hudson Bay. The fur trade began to run out of food energy. Became just a truism of the fur trade that, especially from Montreal, when it depended on canoes for transport, only a limited amount of food could be carried by voyageurs who were traveling at breakneck speed across the subarctic, the Canadian Shield areas of present-day Canada, Ontario, eastern Manitoba, and really needing to have food energy to continue along their way. They ran out of what staples they could carry from Montreal. That was traditionally dried corn, ground up, carried in bags, mixed with pig fat, what little could be carried, and maybe some dried peas. And the voyageur custom of the country, or ration, was doled out every day at the paddle as men exerted themselves over portages or across rivers or lakes.
And so we start to see more pressure to hunt more bison. So they're not so much paying top dollar for other furs. They're really pushing traders to go out and get bison and get pemmican. So it's sort of a shift. And we start to see then that pressure and that emphasis on the bison, changing even how bison are hunted and harvested, and changing how pemmican is even made. So, they start, you think about capitalism today and how, you get a monopoly on things and you start really pushing to make money. So things start to speed up, and you're trying to cut corners, and you're trying to produce and mass produce quantities and quantities of pemmican. So we start to see the effects of that in the production of pemmican and in the actual number of animals harvested, and in fact some of the wastage that you start to see. So this is increasing over this period in the 19th century, and there's just so much pressure going on for these companies. They're each trying to get more pemmican than the other. And then that's compounded completely when Lord Selkirk, he sets up the Red River settlement and encourages a colony to begin. And that completely changes the landscape again. It really affects the supply of food, because of course once the colonists arrive here, they realize that there's a bit of a food shortage, and provisioning for all these people needs to take place. And so it's kind of this period where we start to see the company's influence and sway. They have this monopoly over the region, and yes, other competitors have been able to come in, but here HBC starts really pushing their weight and pushing their emphasis and their control through this colony. And so Miles MacDonnell comes up with the Pemmican Proclamation, and he's saying that you can't take these provisions out of the region. And that not only annoys the other companies, but also HBC traders as well. This greatly affects how they operate, and it greatly affects their relationships that they've built over the years with these Indigenous traders. So that additional pressure of this colony kind of is like the boiling point, and we begin to see tensions rise even more. And it's a part of Canadian history that's often, at least when I took history, glossed over. You don't really think about it as much, because I don't remember learning in depth about it as much. But the effects of this, the Pemmican Proclamation, were huge in the region. And all of a sudden, you've got people that are really, tempers are flaring, livelihoods are at stake. And what's going to happen to these new colonists who are sort of unwittingly brought into this? They really had no say in it, and here they are kind of at the tipping point of what's going to happen to this food source in this region. So we start to see these tensions flaring, and we start to see a lot more conflict. And so, a lot of people here in Winnipeg, at least, are familiar with the Battle of Seven Oaks, and you can still visit the site here in Winnipeg, but it's not as perhaps commonly known outside. So again, this is this tipping point. It wasn't actually supposed to be a battle at all. In fact, it was just circumstances of unfortunate events, I suppose, where HBC, a small group of HBC and some Métis traders interacted. And the interaction, because tensions were high, led to this battle, which led to actually HBC suffering a massive loss. And it was definitely a tarnish on the company, and a tarnish on the relationships in the region. And it was that boiling point that really set things and set the tone for what was going to happen. So it was around that time in 1816 that we start to see the company really begin to rethink their strategy and really begin to take their competition seriously. And then it's shortly later that we see that amalgamation, that merge of Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. So all these events are linked to bison, to pemmican, to supply, and to the fur trade. And it's really an important part of history here in the Canadian Plains. And so that merge, what that meant for the companies, of course, is that all of a sudden they're all combined under one umbrella. And that didn't work for everybody. And that didn't work particularly for a lot of the First Nations and Métis traders who had been relying on these relationships they built with individual posts and individual traders from both companies. And now all of a sudden you've got this monstrosity of a company who is now going in and rethinking their strategy again. And they're starting to scale back. So they're realizing we don't need this many posts now because we don't have competition. So they start scaling back and they start closing posts. And so what that means for people is they have to travel further to access their trade goods, and they have to kind of go on and make new connections and new partnerships. And it's already at a time when food is scarce because of this pemmican demand and then the shortage and the decrease in bison. And so we start to see again that this is becoming kind of a boiling point in history. And so people are faced with new decisions, and the company, of course, is run by Governor George Simpson, who is very much kind of trying to make profits. So he's slashing posts, he's increasing their profits at the corporate level, with little concern or care for what's happening on the ground and to the people on the ground.
The trading sessions with the various First Nations was in some ways institutionalized, but it was always tense. First and foremost, the Hudson's Bay Company made sure that the various bands, where possible, would not come to trade at the same time, because if they showed up at the same time, there seemed to always be fighting going on, constant, and not just fighting. There would be massacres. There were several Fort Edmonton massacres, and it mainly was the tension between the various First Nations bands. But even aside from that, when the bands were ready to trade, they would go through certain formalities with the Hudson's Bay Company personnel, and if they were not followed to the letter, the ceremonial aspects of it, that would tend to cause great tension between the First Nations and the Hudson's Bay Company. And many Hudson's Bay personnel, so many throughout the 19th century, felt personally threatened, and that is why they were so careful to keep up the stockade for such a long time. The First Nations were not allowed into the stockade. They had to trade their goods through a window in the stockade, and again, it was an exercise fraught with tension, because what the Hudson's Bay personnel were offering for these furs or hides was not always what the Indians thought they were worth. And of course, the First Nations demanded certain goods from the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Hudson's Bay Company would not necessarily have the quality goods that maybe they had the year before. So again, most trading sessions were frustrating for both parties, but at the same time, they both needed each other, and they kept coming back year after year, and the Hudson's Bay Company kept welcoming them year after year, and it just was a strange sort of environment where, again, where everybody got along on the surface, but there was so much hostility, so much, really there was a lot of hatred, but commerce seemed to have trumped everything, and it just kept going and going and going.
So it's an interesting moment in Canadian history, and an interesting moment in fur trade history, because this fierce competition between these companies just kind of comes to this halt, and then we have this monopoly by the Hudson's Bay Company as they take over, and trade is definitely dictated. So prior to this, First Nations Métis people had a lot of choice, and now they don't. Now you trade with the Hudson's Bay Company, or you might be able to find some other independent traders, but really HBC has the lockdown on what's happening. So if you don't like their trade goods, unfortunately that's too bad. That's what they've brought in. So it's really interesting to look at that company's history over time, from starting from these beginnings up on Hudson Bay, and then moving into this interior and this fierce competition, and then ending in this monopoly where they've kind of got the run of the show. Really kind of shows that relationship of colonialism and how it starts kind of rather mild, and then it intensifies. And so this relationship between the company and the Indigenous peoples in Canada really is one where it's a process. It's something that takes place over hundreds of years, and it's one that's complicated. So it's definitely difficult to boil it down into something rather simple, because it's highly variable depending on where you are, and highly variable on what time period you're looking at. And we begin to see the company, of course, with their monopoly, really start to again change their business strategy. And Winnipeg becomes a hub, a center where a lot of the fur trade activities happen, Upper Fort Garry, and then Lower Fort Garry. And so we've got these stone forts here in what's now Winnipeg, operating as these head offices, these headquarters. And the company is still operating until they realize more colonists are coming over, and they really don't want to govern. They don't want to have to spend a lot of their time and effort on that. So they shift gears again. And this time, they once again, without any sort of consultation of the local population, sell the majority of their, what is called Rupert's Land, to what is now Canada, in the document called the Deed of Surrender. And so that transaction takes place, it's signed in 1869, but doesn't officially take hold until 1870, of course, because at that time there's also a lot happening here in Red River with the Red River Resistance, which is a direct reflect of this real estate transaction that took place. So a lot of what's happening here, a lot of Winnipeg's history is deeply rooted in fur trade history and deeply rooted in decisions that are made by a company that's not even here in Canada. And so it's a really interesting way to think about global history when you think about this British company that's over here operating in Canada, that's making a lot of decisions that's greatly affecting people here in what's now Canada, and how that shaped the country that we know today, and even the cities that we know today. So Winnipeg is here because of these posts, and you can look at other areas throughout the country. Edmonton was another big post. Fort McMurray was an area where there's a fur trade post. So there's all these dots on the map where HBC established their presence that are still dots on the map in what is now Canada, because of that historic presence in the region.
We've mentioned the Hudson's Bay Company, and it was a state-chartered joint stock monopolistic company. In 1670, it received a charter from the royalty to the prince, and the charter did three things. It incorporated the Hudson's Bay Company. It provided a territory known as Rupert's Land, where it allocated total land rights to the company in an area it could only describe in terms of drainage basins, because they had no idea what was out here. So it granted a territory, and it also granted monopoly trade rights, which the company couldn't always enforce. That was the nature of the companies at this time. Like 1660, you have the British East India Company, and you have Dutch and French East India Companies. You have the Royal African Company that organized the slave trade. So you have all these rather large corporations with global reaches. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company was really sort of small potatoes. It didn't make super profits. It did make money off exchanges, but the total volume of profit and the total volume of sales was not all that significant. But it was a region that contrasted very much to India. India we could describe as a low ratio of land to labor. Things are very crowded, so what it gets exploited in India is labor. Whereas Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory, the ratio of land to labor is very high. So it's never going to be a hugely capital intensive industry. People became interested in the prairie region as a potential area for the development of a land market, for agriculture, for railroads, and for telegraphs. And the company always saw that any settlement would bring about a ruin of its trade, so it always resisted efforts to force it into settlement schemes. But in 1863, the company was taken over by the International Financial Society, and this was one of the earliest English investment banks. In the 1860s, we get the development of a lot of investment banks, and this particular configuration had an international orientation, and their very first act was to buy out the Hudson's Bay Company. And one of the leading railway people at the time, Watkin, was leading this. He had been president. He'd been involved with the Grand Trunk Railway. He ran numerous railways in England, and so they were interested in building a railway that would span across what became Canada, which would also potentially bring the China market closer to London. It would be an alternative route to the Suez Canal, because in 1869 the Suez Canal was problematic. But more so, there was the notion that you could develop a land market in the prairies. So the Hudson's Bay Company, which had a nominal stock value of about £500,000, was taken over by this new investment bank that had just started out for £1.5 million, and they bought up all the shares of all these owners of the Hudson's Bay Company. And it was a very amicable sale. It was a bit of a leveraged buyout in certain senses, but it was agreed to. The price had been agreed to. Governor Barons has said, if these people are so patriotic, why don't they buy us out? And Watkins said, well, how much do you want? Then it became a public company. It was put on the London stock market. The stock was watered. It was floated up to £2 million. The way it's presented in the London stock market as a prospectus was as a land company, that you could speculate in land. So very quickly, the notion of this region shifts from a fur trade region to an area of settlement, railroads, and telegraphs. But the company had this resilience. As I said, they're not phenomenally wealthy relative to other ventures. It had this kind of resilience. So in 1857, you have the mutiny in India, and the consequence of that was the East India Company was severely constrained. In the very same year, there's a similar process where British Parliamentary Committee is looking at the future of the Hudson's Bay Company. And basically, England, or the Colonial Office, was not interested in becoming more involved in governing this area. It had no desires to create a political colonial state in Western Canada. There was no motive, like in contrast to what we might think, where the English are always looking at ways to take over the polity of a people. No interest in that whatsoever. So the private option, the International Financial Society, the beginning of finance capital, taking it over, was what occurred. But the sale of lands was very, very slow. You had the long depression between 1873 and 1897, so there was no quick return on capital for all those enthusiastic speculators that had bought into the Hudson's Bay Company in 1863. It took a long while, but the buyout of the company gave the company from Canada, once the negotiations occurred with Canada. So the first step was a transfer of the Hudson's Bay Company to the International Financial Society and a reorientation of the economic future of the company. The second step was a buyout of the Hudson's Bay Company's charter rights by Canada. So after 1867, and you have the Canadian nation state in a very embryonic form, they are keen to get their hands on Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory. And they sort of feel they should get it for nothing. And instead, the Colonial Office forces them to negotiate with the Hudson's Bay Company. And what the company got out of it wasn't bad, although the shareholders would have been disappointed. They got a payment of £300,000. They got 50,000 acres around their posts. So around Fort Edmonton, they ended up with 3,000 acres. So they had a big impact on the urban land market. And then 1/20th of the Fertile Belt. So the area that was surveyed into townships in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, which was a vast area, they received 1/20th of that. And then they sold that off. So this was a huge capital grant. They probably made more money out of selling land between say, 1901 and 1931 than they had in the fur trade. And they managed that capital grant very well. So here's the irony for Canadian history. And most Canadian historians like to present the fur trade as a partnership between the Europeans and the indigenous people. I think this is a totally objectionable and vacuous notion. But what we see as a consequence is one group of people are driven to poverty and end up tracking into the treaty process. And the mercantile group and the people like the International Financial Society and investment bankers accumulate wealth. And so the size of that land grant, the 1/20th of the Fertile Belt and the 50,000 acres around the posts, is over 7 million acres. So this amount of acreage is much bigger than the acres allocated as reserve lands. So with the demise, not simply of the buffalo, but coincident, we have the demise of the fur trade, institutional and organizational changes. They weren't sudden. The company wisely did not abandon the fur trade in 1869. It continued to operate the fur trade. But with these vast land sales, they were able to shift from a post-like store selling a number of goods and shift it into the modern department store. So from their land sales, they could capitalize things like stores, warehouses, things of this nature. So the company was able to survive. It's the only one of the large state-chartered monopoly companies that survived to modern times. All the others were dinosaurs and became extinct. So it's with this First Nations track into a treaty process, which they basically make the best of a bad deal. They basically see the changes that are coming and the problems that have been created with resources and incomes, and they seek a treaty process. And the Crown is interested in a treaty process, partly because of the Royal Proclamation, but also because of the Imperial Order and Council of the 23rd of June, 1870, that transfers the Hudson's Bay Company charter rights to the UK Imperial Crown and then to Canada. And in that are obligations, I think very strong obligations, where any claims of the Indians to lands required for settlement will be compensated for by Canada and not the Hudson's Bay Company. So the Imperial Order and Council of 23 June 1870 is part of our Constitution. It's how Canada acquired, from their point of view, sovereignty over this area, and therefore it's part of the Constitution. And there are unlitigated rights based on this Imperial Order and Council. But they track, and that's sort of a foundation for the treaty process as well. So they track into the treaty process, and they try and make the best of a bad deal. The negotiations at Treaty 1 are very much the chiefs come with an economic agenda, and they seek certain economic benefits out of the arrangement.
One of the great myths of Western Canadian history is that the bison disappeared with the coming of the railway and white settlers. And it makes for a great story. It actually makes for a good yarn because it matches the story that's often told in the United States. You'll hear about people traveling west on the train, shooting from train windows at small herds of bison and related stories. The truth of the matter, though, in Canada is that the bison, the great northern bison herds, were essentially gone by the late 1870s. And yet they didn't build the Canadian Pacific Railway across the prairies until the early 1880s. In fact, that last spike isn't driven until November 1885. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And as I said, it's a nice story, but it doesn't fit the circumstances. There were about 5 to 6 million bison in Western Canada, what we call the Northern Plains, at the start of the 19th century and the early 1800s. And yet by the 1860s, 2/3 of them are gone. And many of the First Nations bands are facing starvation because of the declining bison herds, and part of that is because of the Métis bison hunt and the demand for pemmican to keep the Hudson's Bay Company operations going. Part of that starvation is that First Nations bands would hunt in a particular area, but as the herds contracted, it became increasingly difficult for them to find enough bison to meet their daily needs. And so what you have is that you have First Nations bands, the Cree, the Assiniboine from the Saskatchewan country, moving in the Blackfoot territory. And they're often described as an armed hunting expeditions, and they're essentially moving into enemy territory because they're in conflict with the Blackfoot over access to horses, over access to weapons, but in particular over access to bison. And you've got large camps of First Nations bands in the Cypress Hills in southwestern Saskatchewan, southeastern Alberta, and into Montana in search of bison. And you've got some of the largest concentrations of First Nations people in that area in the 1860s and 1870s in search of bison. What happens is by the end of the 1860s, with the bison in decline, First Nations decimated by disease, tired of fighting one another, they face acute starvation at the start of the 1870s, and that's one of the reasons they petitioned the federal government to come and meet with them and deal with treaties. Sweetgrass, one of the leading chiefs from the Fort Pitt area, more or less says, and I paraphrase, "We heard our land was sold and we don't like it." They want to meet with Canadian officials. And those Canadian officials don't arrive to deal with the Cree of central Saskatchewan and Alberta until 1876. And what's very telling about those treaty meetings, both at Carleton and at Fort Pitt, is that one of the urgent concerns of the First Nations leaders, representatives, is they talk about the declining bison herds and what can be done to save them. Now, nothing is written into the treaties about protection of the bison. There is a famine clause in Treaty 6 which reflects their concern, but they are very concerned about the disappearance of the bison. Chief Beardy, one of his counselors, he's a Willow Cree from the Batoche area, he more or less says to the treaty commissioner, "One of the great things I fear are the disappearance of the bison, and as I look around I only see one." That's a metaphor for the rapid disappearance, decline of the bison and their concern. I can only see one. So the bison and its rapid disappearance in the 1870s is of serious concern to the Cree. In fact, one scholar suggested that if they started at Fort Pitt first, the treaty commissioners, and not Carleton, they actually went from Carleton to Pitt, the Indians at Fort Pitt were vitally concerned about this situation. That's all they wanted to talk about. And one scholar has suggested that the treaty deliberations might have been quite different if they started at Fort Pitt and moved to Carleton. So what does the Indian Commissioner do? Alexander Morris, he says that the Northwest Territories Council will look into bison preservation. It's on their agenda. They're going to deal with it. It's not entered into the treaties. But when Alexander Morris gets back to Canada, the Dominion of Canada, and he reports to Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie, he tells them that he's very pleased with the work he's accomplished with Treaty 6 signed in 1876. But he says the burning issue was food. The burning issue was hunger. The burning issue was the bison. And he says something has to be done or we're going to face a serious situation. What happens, though, is that the Northwest Territories Council doesn't act on this matter until 1877. And by then, it's more or less too late. The provisions they bring forward place limitations on the taking of bison, but what upsets the First Nations is that these regulations limit First Nations hunting when they want singular access to the bison herds. And what happens by 1879, it's called the starvation summer, is that the great northern bison herds no longer come north into Canada. And Edgar Dewdney, who starts that summer as Indian Commissioner for the Northwest Territories and Lieutenant Governor, he visits several Cree bands, and they need help. They're desperate for help in 1879. And what he does in meeting with them is that he provides them with ammunition and he encourages them to go south to hunt. But by 1879, they face a starvation crisis. It's nothing that was done deliberately, it's just happens. They didn't expect the bison to disappear for at least another decade. And it took people familiar with Western Canada who had lived there, worked there, it took them totally by surprise. But as I said, it's not a deliberate policy. And at first, the Canadian government and its Indian policy is to encourage the Indians to go south and hunt so they don't have to feed them. But that presents a problem. You have Canadian Indians traveling into American territory, and there could be an international incident. The other problem is that Canada wants to proceed with white settlement, and they can't have Indians roaming the territories in search of the few remaining bison when you've got white settlers coming in. So what Canada decides to do is limit First Nations trips to the United States. They try and prevent Indians from roaming across the border. And they deliberately introduce a policy where these hungry Indians in search of bison are not entitled to rations. They're not being fed by the federal government unless they enter treaty. So what happens in the late 1870s, early 1880s, in particular 1881, Big Bear enters treaty because his band is facing starvation. They're not going to get rations until they enter treaty. Not only do they use rations to get First Nations to enter treaty, but they use rations to get First Nations to move to their reserves. So they withhold rations from Indians that refuse to move to the reserve. And so there's a deliberate attempt by the Canadian government to get Indians first to enter treaty and then to move to the reserves where they can resume or start farming. And John A. Macdonald has asked this question in the House of Commons about Indians, and he says it's actually a good thing that the bison have disappeared, and he says that in the House, because First Nations have stopped wandering, they're forced to settle down, and they're forced to make the transition to agriculture. The other side of that, though, is that if they're going to make that transition to agriculture, they needed adequate government support and assistance, which was not forthcoming.
The buffalo, or bison, of course, is very important to Indigenous people, Indigenous culture, Indigenous spirituality, because of what it provided for the people. We call him Nimosomnan, or our grandfather, and that gives us a kinship to the buffalo, and we are related to the buffalo, as well as other animal species as well, the winged ones, the ones that crawl on the ground, everything is related. But the buffalo, of course, is central to a lot of the lifestyle, because they provided the material for clothing, shelter, even the fuel for the fires out on the prairies. There isn't very much wood on some of the prairie lands, so the buffalo dung was used to provide for fire.
With the signing of the treaties and the movement of First Nations to reserves and the adoption of agriculture, there's a transition period and they need to be fed. And so the Canadian government initially contracted with the Hudson's Bay Company to provide pemmican. But with the dramatic decline in the bison herds, they couldn't provide pemmican. They actually tried at one point to look into providing food from caribou, providing a caribou kind of or reindeer kind of pemmican from northern Saskatchewan and parts of northern Canada. That didn't work, and as a consequence, the Canadian government had to contract for pork, in particular bacon, and so they started off with this contract for pemmican, which they couldn't fulfill because of the decline of the bison herds, and so they had to shift to different kinds of food to feed the First Nations.
Okay, so I guess one thing we need to realize, or we need to recognize, is that with the arrival of Europeans, it wasn't just them bringing the economy, it was them bringing their germs. You know, I've talked about this elsewhere, where not understanding the medical history of Indigenous people, if you're only looking at the economics and the politics, you're really only understanding part of the issue. So as the first traders came out here, they brought diseases that literally, in some cases, decimated the population. 9 out of 10 people may have died of diseases like smallpox that were introduced in the 18th century. Successive generations, probably there were generational epidemics every 30, 40 years through the 18th and early 19th centuries, again, undermining the population, the well-being. But until Canada acquired Rupert's Land in 1869, the food situation out here in the prairies was actually pretty good. We know that the bison populations, the bison herds were receding, they were moving further west. The Red River hunt was weighing upon the herds. But until Canada sort of moved into this territory, First Nations were in pretty good shape with regard to nutrition and their diet. First Nations leaders knew that when the white people came, there would be a change. Many of the chiefs said that you know, we can't stop the white people. We've really got to work on a bridge to the future. So one of the negotiations that took place was Indigenous people, the negotiators, basically worked on the bridge to the future was the development of agriculture. So during the treaty negotiations, there were often promises to provide implements to develop agriculture on reserves. At Treaty 6, one of the negotiators, Chief Beardy, he was very concerned about food security in the future. He didn't use those terms, but basically that's what he was worried about. And he was wise enough to negotiate what's called the Famine and Pestilence Clause into the terms of Treaty 6. And what that said was that it forced the government into a commitment that in a time of crisis, First Nations people would not be allowed to starve, basically. So that was a major impediment to the completion of Treaty 6. Alexander Morris, the representative of the Queen, the treaty commissioner, thought that promise might be too generous. Like, you know, he said, we're not going to feed you every day, you're not going to be supplied with free food. And over the course of a few days, this was negotiated into basically famine relief. What no one really foresaw at the negotiations at Fort Carlton in 1876 was that in less than 2 years, that clause would come into pretty stark focus. In the spring of 1878, the bison throughout the prairies basically disappeared forever. There were some remnant herds, but through a whole bunch of different reasons, through hide hunting in the United States, through predation from the Red River, from hunting here, and even from military action in the United States. The American military went on campaign to kill as many bison as possible to pacify, as in their terminology, the Native Americans on the other side of the line. When that happened, when the bison finally disappeared in the spring of 1878, no one had prepared for it. There was basically a skeleton crew of Canadian officials. In fact, there was one Indian agent named Dickinson who I think advocated for the well-being of First Nations people, and he wrote prolifically in the spring of 1878 saying that he needed money and he needed resources, and above all he needed food. And from the spring of 1878 on, food was regularly delivered to Canada from basically the storehouses at Fort Benton, Montana, maybe a week or so bull train away. What that did was, as I said, the Agent Dickinson and the small crew of Canadian officials did their best over the summer of 1878 to meet the famine, and it was literally a famine. Northwest Mounted Police doctors were shocked at how quickly the health situation of First Nations people changed. in the fall of 77, people were healthy. By the spring of 78, when they were coming in after the winter, they were hungry and they were getting sick, and they were getting sick in greater and greater numbers. So I think for that first summer of the famine, the Dominion government did what they could, with the power they had to deal with the famine. Where things really change is in the fall of 1878 with the election of the Conservative government under John A. Macdonald. It was the national policy election, and he was really hanging his future, his political future, on the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And the idea was that he promised to build the railway as quickly as possible, basically connecting Ontario with British Columbia that had joined Confederation a few years earlier. As he took on his new mandate, something we don't always realize is that in addition to being Prime Minister, Macdonald served as the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, basically the Minister of Indian Affairs. Even in 2020, Macdonald was the longest serving Minister of Indian Affairs in Canadian history. He served for 10 years. And the reason why he did that, and he wrote this in his correspondence, was that the management of Indigenous issues, Indian affairs, was so important to the completion of the railroad project that he didn't entrust it to anyone else. So you could imagine on his desk he had his Prime Minister pile, and he also had his Indian Affairs pile. And so the management of Indian affairs was driven by security for the railway rather than the benefit of the Indigenous people. What that means is that as Macdonald replaced the Liberal officials, the Liberal government officials who were out here, with his own Conservative officials, they were given the primary directive that in this time of famine, only Indigenous people who had entered into treaty, only treaty Indians in the old terminology, would be provided with food. And what our research found was that within 18 months of that new proviso being put into place in 1879, more than half of the Indigenous population of Alberta and Saskatchewan entered into treaty. So rather than the nation-to-nation negotiations that had taken place earlier on in the 1870s, we're in Treaty 4 territory, 1874 here, people were essentially coerced into treaty, signing on to treaty and giving up their freedom in exchange for food. And many, many communities basically were driven to their reserves through the allocation of food, having entered into treaty.
What's interesting about the experiment, and I call it an experiment in getting First Nations to adopt agriculture, is that it's an experiment for anybody who comes to the Canadian Plains in the 1870s, 1880s. Up until the acquisition of Rupert's Land in the Northwestern Territory, fur traders did engage in a limited bit of agriculture, but these are garden plots. They're trying to diversify an otherwise monotonous diet, and there was no record of proven agricultural success up until 1869, 1870. So when I say it's an experiment, it truly is an experiment. They have to learn how to farm these peculiar semi-arid prairies where evaporation exceeds precipitation on an annual basis every year. And so it takes a lot of trial and experimentation. The difference is, though, is that white settlers, when they came in and got their homestead and tried to adopt farming and turn their pioneer farms into commercial operations, 2 out of 5 fail. They don't talk about that. 2 out of 5 fail. 40% of the homesteaders fail. In the case of First Nations, yes, they fail too. It's not an easy thing to do to simply pick up tomorrow agriculture and be successful at it. But unlike the white settlers who abandoned their homesteads and moved on to other parts of Western Canada or gave up farming completely, First Nations had to stay on the reserves, had to make do with limited agricultural assistance. So it's a kind of a double whammy. They don't get the kind of assistance and direction and supervision they need to make that transition in agriculture, but at the same time they're asking them to do something in a couple of years that's actually going to take a couple of decades. And it isn't until the beginning of the 20th century with the introduction of an early maturing wheat and different farming techniques, that agriculture really takes off in Western Canada. So it was an experiment, and they placed unreal expectations on First Nations people.
So regarding treaties, from the Crown's perspective, the completion of treaties were basically a legal obstacle to overcome. By signing the treaties, from their perspective, they were gaining, and this is is becoming an ever more controversial interpretation, they were gaining this extinguishment of Indigenous title to the land. That interpretation has now been challenged, and I think we're going to hear more and more about that in the coming years. From the First Nations perspective, entering into the treaties was taking on a whole new approach to diet, to lifestyle, basically to their way of life. So the way to think about this, and this was probably a very tough choice on the part of the Indigenous negotiators. They were moving from a very highly nutritious diet, like one of them, like the Plains bison hunters were the tallest people in the world in the mid-19th century, to a very high protein, low fat diet, and as much as people wanted for millennia. And what they knew they were shifting to was a grain-based diet, like from farming. So imagine, in one hand you have a pound of bison meat, and on the other hand you have a pound of flour that you've grown your wheat from. The nutrition value is so much lower. So this was a risk. I think Indigenous leaders knew that they had to take this on, because they knew that the bison couldn't coexist, with the white people who were coming into that territory. So the establishment of farming was critically important for First Nations people, like reserve farming. To the Crown and the representatives of the Dominion government, farming was probably more of an act of civilization rather than a straightforward means of gaining subsistence. This was all part of a quote-unquote civilizing mission that the government had undertaken, in addition to allowing missionaries in to convert them to Christianity, and basically settlement and agriculture were part of that package. Medicine as well was part of that package. So as people were forced onto reserves through that coercive application of the Famine and Pestilence Clause, reserve agriculture became critically important. As Indigenous people on reserves took up agriculture, they were even more under the thumb of basically white Canadian government officials. And so there are many reports of any time authority was questioned on reserves, that entire communities could be cut off food rations for as long as a week. And at Battleford, there are numerous cases through the late 1870s and into the 1880s of entire communities being cut off rations. And you can just imagine the level of coercion that would involve. Another aspect of First Nations farming was it's a catch-22. In order to be provided with agricultural implements to set up farming, and First Nations people were aware of farming, even if they practiced gardening and stuff like that during the fur trade period, they knew the value of agriculture. They'd seen it at fur trade posts and at different communities. Again, from the government perspective, the act of farming was more important than the produce of farming. So from 1881 on, there was something called the permit system, which was intended to keep food that was being grown, and it was very unsuccessful at the time, to keep food being grown on reserve for the First Nations people. But really the effect it had was to bar First Nations farmers from getting their produce into the commercial economy. And some of the early European settlers complained that First Nations people had an advantage because they'd set up their farms prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And so through that kind of politics, the permit system was enacted. That permit system was in play well into the 20th century. And really what it meant was that any agricultural produce, any firewood, anything coming from reserve required the written permission of basically a white Canadian official to be sold in the marketplace. So I remember speaking to an elder from Treaty 6 territory who said he and his family spent the entire winter cutting wood, and were ready to sell it in the local community, and the Indian agent didn't give them permission. So they'd worked an entire winter for nothing. So that was a very common occurrence. Another aspect, once people were forced onto reserves, was after 1885 there was something called the pass system that was imposed. And the correspondence between Johnny MacDonald and his lieutenant out here in the west, Edgar Dewdney, revealed that Dewdney knew that to force people to stay on reserves, like basically incarcerate people on reserves, they'd have to change the terms of the treaty, which said that Indigenous people had free movement through the land. MacDonald said, we don't really care about that. We're just going to ask the Northwest Mounted Police, or order the Northwest Mounted Police, to impose this system. And so from 1885 well into the 1950s, a quote-unquote treaty Indian, a First Nations person who was a member of treaty, and most of them were, what that meant was they couldn't leave their community without a written document signed by a government official. And if you didn't have that document and you went to town without permission, you could be locked up in jail. You were probably escorted back to your community, but you really weren't allowed to travel freely. So if you think about that in the context of a growing commercial economy out here in the West, we've got the myth of, the prairie agriculture, being the breadbasket of the world. First Nations people were literally barred from entering that economy, which kept them poor for decades. So it's acknowledged that First Nations people owned all of the territory here in Western Canada. That was basically the legal premise for the treaties, even though the surrender of land wasn't discussed at the treaty negotiations. Was probably the words cede, surrender, relinquish were probably added at the Queen's printer in the official documentation rather than in the negotiations themselves. So almost overnight, within the span of a couple of years, First Nations people went from having free range of hundreds of thousands of square kilometers to basically being located on very small reserves. I think the amount of reserve land in Western Canada is less than 1% of the total land mass. So over the span of a couple of years, people went from having free access to literally hundreds of thousands of square kilometers to essentially being placed on an internment camp once the pass system was imposed. With the permit system, as I said, there were legal and economic impediments to entering into the commercial economy, and what that did was that kept people poor on reserve up until the present. So the MacDonald's oversight of Indian Affairs and his management of the Canadian Pacific Railway project, as I said, they dovetailed together, and they were each important to the other. As the railway project moved west, and if you've ever driven between Winnipeg and Calgary, you know that there's nothing really in the way, so the railway project advanced pretty quickly. Once it got to the town where I live, Regina, it got there in 1882, and just prior to the arrival of the construction crews in 82, MacDonald in the House of Commons said that the 5,000 or 7,000 people, Indigenous people, who were living in the Cypress Hills at the time would be removed by force if necessary in order to secure the railway construction project as it was proceeding west into the Cypress Hills. So what that meant was that the 5,000 or 7,000 people who were really just trying to survive in the Cypress Hills, trying to look for alternative resources than the bison, really just trying to mind their own business, and lobbying to have their reserves put in the Cypress Hills, were starved out of that location, and thousands of them were forced hundreds of kilometers west toward Battleford, where there's quite a large accumulation of reserves these days. And really what that was it was MacDonald's oversight and ethnically cleansing southwestern Saskatchewan of its Indigenous people to clear the land for the railway. As the railway proceeded, um, basically once the railway was established, the land was flooded with settlers because you had an industrial means of bringing Europeans into this land. So the railway was truly the death knell of freedom for First Nations people. You know, it's a symbol, it's the backbone of the Dominion of Canada, but I think it really represents the end of freedom for First Nations people out in this territory. So by 1885, things were so bad on reserves that anyone who had the ability to do so, because there had been almost 200 years of interaction between fur traders and Indigenous people by that time, there were a lot of First Nations people who could claim some European ancestry, be it a father, grandfather, or some kind of relative. And in the aftermath of 1885, probably any First Nations person who could renounced their Indian status, took something called scrip, which was basically a certificate for land, and legally became Métis. So in some communities, the majority of people went from being a legal Indian to becoming a new status, Métis. So the Métis were citizens. First Nations people didn't get full citizenship until 1960. It doesn't mean that the situation for Métis was very good. They were displaced. The scrip system was essentially a large land scam undertaken by speculators, and some white people got very, very rich on it, basically exchanging those certificates for land for a few cents on the dollar of their value. So the Métis were displaced. There's a time they're known as the road allowance people, but they didn't suffer the draconian policies that First Nations people were subjected to. So as a health researcher, their outcome was certainly not equal to that of the European settlers, but it wasn't as dismal as that suffered over generations by First Nations people. So one of the biggest ecological changes that happened through the 1870s with the disappearance of the bison was the expansion of the ranching frontier. And an American scholar has written that the expansion of cattle ranching in the western United States and into Canada was the largest short-term supervised migration of herd animals in human history. Probably 10 or 12 million cattle were driven north from Texas. And in my research, what I found was that cattle were imported from mostly Spain into Texas, which is kind of a recreation of an Iberian climate. But as they were driven north, 2,000, 2,500 kilometers, some of those cattle, it was like a death march for cattle. They might have left Texas where they were in very good shape. They had to be driven daily, maybe 50 kilometers a day. They were really being pushed. And by the time they got to Canadian territory, it could be winter, and this is the end of the Little Ice Age, so winters were much colder than they are these days. Some of those cattle were really on the brink of, they were on the brink of malnutrition, and cattle are primary hosts for tuberculosis. So what you had was some of the cattle that had completed this, the drive from Texas into Saskatchewan or into Alberta, were basically infectious with TB. And the First Nations people that ate those cows, they were malnourished to begin with because the ration policy was so stringent that entire communities may have been infected with tuberculosis in sharing one or two cattle that may have come to the community. So as a health researcher, what I found was that the policies sort of overseen by MacDonald and his descendants in the bureaucracy, what they did was they controlled essentially what we would call these days the social determinants of health. By keeping people poor, by keeping people in poor housing conditions, we all know about the residential school system with regard to education. By keeping, keeping the lid down on those factors, that's what really had an effect on undermining health of First Nations people. So for us in the 21st century, really what we've got to do, and it's acknowledged, there was a federal government minister just a couple of years ago that said that there was a 15-year life expectancy difference between First Nations people and non-Indigenous people. Like that's a huge amount. But really the way to close that gap is not necessarily through medical means. What it is to deal with those social determinants of health. So what we as a society need to do is we need to improve economic conditions, improve economic opportunities with regard to Indigenous people. We need to improve education. There's a 30% gap between provincially funded school children here in Saskatchewan and schools that are overseen by the federal government on reserves. We need to address that gap in order to ensure a higher level of education success, like graduations and that kind of thing. So, as I said, in my research, what I found was that controlling those social forces really had an impact on the health. And there's never been a time from the signing of the treaties in the 1870s to the present when health conditions among Indigenous people have been equal to that of the newcomers, of the settlers. So if we all die together at about the same age, that's a sign of an equitable society. In the course of the last few years, I've had a lot of people question, well, surely, you know, the Canadian experience, the Canadian relationship with First Nations people has to be better than what it was in the United States. I guess a few things to think about in that regard is that during the time when McDonald's starvation policies were being implemented, some First Nations people who resided in Canada actually went to the United States to find sanctuary. So it wasn't, you know, like exclusively doom and gloom in the United States, and it wasn't as rosy a picture as a lot of us think it was in Canada. In the United States, there was certainly a lot of violence. There were, you know, so-called Indian wars. But one of the things, I guess, to think about was, even in war, the United States considered the Indigenous people to be nations, and so they had surrenders, but on reservations, they are considered to be sovereign nations. So in an American reservation, there are very few laws, American laws, that apply on those reservations. I think it's like kidnapping and murder, and maybe a couple other ones. First Nations people have self-government. In the Canadian experience, we didn't have a whole lot of physical violence using guns. We certainly had a lot of violence imposed through the residential school system, through the pass system, the permit system, you know, the meager rations policy, and the failure of agriculture. So while we didn't have, you know, armed violence, what we had instead was, through the Indian Act, the infantilization of First Nations people. So the Indian Act essentially turned an adult male, things were pretty patriarchal back in the 1870s, an adult male essentially had the legal status of a child. So all First Nations people were bureaucratically rebranded as wards of the state. And as wards of the state, they really didn't have a lot of rights. In fact, Canadian First Nations people didn't get the right to vote until 1960.